Welcome to Sleeping Times. Have you ever stopped to think that the note in your wallet is nothing more than a piece of paper? And yet, you would trade hours of your day, perhaps even years of your life, for these small, colored rectangles. Why? The truth is that money is one of the most mysterious and powerful inventions of humanity, not because it has intrinsic value, but because we all collectively agree that it does. This simple yet revolutionary idea completely changed the course of civilization. And this story, which began more than 5,000 years ago with farmers trading grain in Mesopotamia and reached the cryptocurrencies you see in the news today, is much more fascinating and sometimes more disturbing than you imagine. If you're enjoying the content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell notification so you don't miss any of our stories. Your company here means a lot to us. Oh, and don't forget to leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always incredible to see how our community is spread across the world. Now, how about turning off the lights, finding a comfortable position, and preparing yourself for a journey through 5,000 years of economic history, from the first exchanges to the digital money we use today. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself 12,000 years ago, when agriculture was just beginning to transform human life. You've just harvested more grain than your family can consume. Your children need new clothes for the approaching winter, but you don't know how to weave. On the other side of the village, someone has hides and fabrics, but doesn't have enough food. It seems simple, doesn't it? You trade your surplus for theirs. But what if he doesn't need grain at that exact moment? What if he already has enough food and is looking for stone tools? This is the first great economic problem of humanity, the double coincidence of wants. In the first agricultural communities of the Fertile Crescent, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, this problem became more complex with each generation. It wasn't just a matter of trading wheat for hides. And what when you needed something worth far more than any single item you possessed? Imagine needing an ox to plow your field. A strong ox could be worth the equivalent of 100 baskets of grain. You couldn't simply cut the ox into pieces to make smaller trades. The indivisibility of certain goods created a deadlock that paralyzed commerce and limited the growth of societies. Think about how many transactions you make in a single day today. You buy coffee in the morning, pay rent, maybe buy gasoline or shop online. Each of these transactions takes seconds. Now imagine if each one required you to find someone who wanted exactly what you have to offer at the exact moment you need what they have. How much of your day would be consumed just negotiating basic trades? The Sumerians, around 3500 BC, faced exactly this dilemma as their cities grew. Uruk, one of the first great cities in the world, reached more than 50,000 inhabitants. Specialized artisans produced pottery, bronze tools, and jewelry. Farmers cultivated barley and dates. Fishermen brought fish from the river. Herders raised sheep and goats. Each person had something to offer, but the possible combinations of direct trades became mathematically impossible to manage. How do you coordinate an economy when there are thousands of people and hundreds of different types of goods and services? The solution began to emerge not from kings or priests, but from practical necessity. People began to accept certain goods not because they needed them immediately, but because they knew others would accept them too. Barley became one of these first proto-currencies in Mesopotamia. It was durable enough to store, divisible into smaller portions, and universally desired. Sumerian temples began to function as the first banks, storing grain and issuing clay receipts that could be exchanged. These small clay tokens, with cuneiform marks indicating quantities, were technically the first abstract representations of value. But barley had obvious limitations. It could rot if poorly stored. Rats and insects could destroy entire fortunes overnight. It was heavy to transport in large quantities. Imagine trying to travel from one city to another carrying all your money in grain. A business trip could require an entire caravan just to transport your capital. The search for something more practical, more durable, more portable was just beginning. In ancient Egypt, meanwhile, another system was developing. The pharaohs of the Third Dynasty, around 2700 BC, used rings of copper and gold as a measure of value. These metals had fascinating properties. They didn't rot, could be melted and divided, were relatively rare, which gave them intrinsic value, and had practical uses in tools and ornaments. An Egyptian scribe could record that an ox was worth 8 deben of copper, approximately 9–10 grams of the metal. But transactions still didn't use coins as we know them. The metal was weighed at each transaction, a slow process, subject to fraud. Have you ever stopped to think about why we trust small pieces of paper or numbers on a screen as a representation of value? What makes something money? The Sumerians and Egyptians were asking exactly that question 5,000 years ago. They were discovering that money isn't really about the physical object, it's about trust and collective agreement. If everyone agrees that something has value, then it has value. But gaining that collective trust, especially when each city-state had its own systems, was a monumental challenge. The difficulties of barter also created deep social inequalities. Those who controlled durable and desirable goods, such as precious metals or large quantities of grain, had an advantage over those who produced perishable goods or services. A baker who made fresh bread every day had to trade quickly before his merchandise spoiled, often accepting unfavorable terms. Meanwhile, a metal merchant could wait patiently for the best deal. This asymmetry of economic power shaped the first social hierarchies in ways that still echo today. In ancient China during the Shang dynasty in 600–146 BC, cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean became a widely accepted form of money. These small, shiny, and durable shells were perfect as currency. Impossible to counterfeit with the technology of the time, beautiful enough to be desired as ornament, and rare enough to maintain value. Chinese characters for many economic concepts, such as wealth, buy, and sell, still contain the radical that represents the cowrie shell. But even this system had flaws. As trade expanded, demand for shells outpaced supply, leading to liquidity crises that paralyzed entire markets. The primitive trade routes between Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley faced an additional problem: how to compare values between different economic systems. If a Sumerian merchant arrived in Egypt with his barley and clay tokens, how would he convert them into the Egyptian system of copper deben? Primitive exchange houses began to appear at ports and city borders, where specialists made these complex conversions. These were the first international bankers, and they charged substantial fees for their specialized services. The economic inefficiency of barter not only slowed commerce, it limited human thinking about the future itself. How could you plan for retirement when your wealth consisted of grain that would rot, or animals that would age and die? How could you invest in long-term projects when there was no stable way to store value through time? These limitations kept societies trapped in cycles of subsistence, preventing the accumulation of capital necessary for great innovations. Archaeologists discovered in Çatalhöyük, in present-day Turkey, a Neolithic city from 9,000 years ago, fascinating evidence of the complexities of barter. Murals show transactions involving multiple parties, suggesting that people developed elaborate systems of social credit and debt. Essentially, they kept mental records of who owed what to whom. But as communities grew beyond a few hundred people, these systems of collective memory became impossible to maintain. The human mind has limits to how many social relationships it can manage simultaneously. We needed something external to track these obligations. Humanity's first written records were not poetry or history, they were economic records. The oldest cuneiform tablets from Uruk are essentially invoices and receipts. 3 sheep from so-and-so to so-and-so, 10 baskets of barley received by the temple. Writing was born from economic necessity, from the desperate attempt to overcome the limitations of barter and human memory. Think about it, civilization as we know it, with writing, laws, and complex institutions, emerged directly from the attempt to solve the problem of commerce. The Mesopotamians developed a revolutionary concept around 2400 BC, the shekel. Initially, shekel wasn't a physical coin, but a unit of weight, approximately 8.3 grams of silver. When someone said something cost 2 shekels, it meant it was worth the weight of approximately 16.6 grams of silver. But the silver didn't need to be physically present. Temples and palaces kept records on clay tablets, recording credits and debits in shekels. It was a system of abstract money existing mainly as numbers in accounting records. Does that sound familiar? It's essentially the same principle as the digital banking systems we use today, developed more than 4,000 years ago. And then comes the question that would keep philosophers and economists occupied for the next 5 millennia. What exactly is value? Why is a piece of shiny metal worth more than days of hard work? Why does something that cannot feed us, clothe us, or shelter us have more economic power than things essential for survival? The first Sumerian and Egyptian thinkers didn't have definitive answers, just as we often don't have them today. But they were about to take the next crucial step, transforming these abstractions into physical objects that would fit in the palm of a hand, objects that would change the course of human history in ways they could never imagine. There is something profoundly human about assigning value to objects. Long before any formal monetary system, our ancestors valued things not for their practical utility, but for their rarity, beauty, or symbolic meaning. In caves in South Africa, archaeologists found beads made from seashells dating back 75,000 years ago, evidence that even in the Paleolithic, humans were creating and exchanging objects of purely social value. These beads didn't feed anyone or provide shelter, but they represented something more: status, connection, perhaps even promises of future reciprocity. We were economic creatures before we were even farmers. In ancient Polynesia, large discs of limestone called rai served as money on the island of Yap. Some of these discs were more than 3 meters in diameter and weighed several tons. Obviously, you didn't carry them to the market to buy fish. Instead, these rai remained in fixed locations, and ownership changed through social agreement. Everyone on the island knew who the owner of each stone was, even if it never moved. A particularly valuable rai could even be at the bottom of the ocean, lost during transport. But it still maintained its value because everyone agreed it existed and belonged to someone. This forces us to ask, does money really need to be physical, or is it fundamentally a shared idea? In the Melanesian archipelago, strings of shells called shell money, or tambu, served similar functions. Women dove into deep waters to collect specific shells, which were then meticulously cleaned, pierced, and strung onto cords. The process of creation was so laborious that the work itself conferred value. A single cord could represent hundreds of hours of human effort. Here was a crucial economic principle emerging. Value could be derived not just from the rarity of the material, but from the labor invested in its creation. Karl Marx, thousands of years later, would build entire theories about this labor theory of value. But the Melanesians were already practicing it intuitively. In pre-Columbian North America, wampum, belts and cords made of white and purple shell beads, served as money among various indigenous nations. But wampum was more than currency. It was also a system of historical and diplomatic record. Specific patterns in the beads represented peace agreements, marriages between tribes, and important events. Imagine money that simultaneously functioned as a legal contract, historical archive, and medium of exchange. The arrival of Europeans completely destabilized this system when they began producing fake wampum in mass quantities using metal tools, creating the first documented inflation in the Americas, a harbinger of the problems counterfeiting would cause in all future monetary systems. In ancient Zimbabwe between the years 1200 and 1450 AD, Great Zimbabwe became a powerful commercial center. There, beyond the gold they traded with Arab merchants on the Indian Ocean coast, they used a complex system involving cloth, livestock, and iron tools as measures of value. Livestock was particularly interesting as money because it reproduced. It was literally money that generated more money. A rich man wasn't measured by how many coins he had, but by how many head of cattle he owned. But this created a curious problem. How do you save when your money can die of disease or be stolen by predators? Financial security required pastures, guards, and veterinary knowledge. Wealth management was inseparable from the management of living beings. Salt in countless civilizations played a crucial role as proto-currency. In the Roman Empire, soldiers sometimes received part of their payment in salt, hence the word salary coming from salarium, the salt ration of legionaries. In the African Sahel, bars of salt extracted from Taoudeni in the Sahara desert were so valuable they were exchanged weight for weight with gold in cities like Timbuktu. Camel caravans crossed deadly deserts transporting this white gold. Why was salt so valuable? Because in hot climates, food preservation and electrolyte replacement were matters of life and death. A commodity essential for survival naturally becomes currency. In Siberia and parts of Europe, animal furs, especially sables and beavers, functioned as money for centuries. The Russian word for money, dengi, may originate from denga, a Tatar word for squirrel, whose furs were a common monetary unit. Furs had clear advantages. They were light relative to their value, durable when well treated, and had constant demand in cold climates. But they also had disadvantages. Quality varied enormously, making transactions disputable, could be damaged by moths and moisture, and their supply fluctuated drastically with seasons and animal populations. A plague that decimated beavers could cause a severe economic crisis. Have you ever wondered why gold became so universally valued? It's not because it's particularly useful. It's too soft for effective tools. It's not because it's essential for survival. Gold triumphed as currency through an almost accidental combination of properties. It's rare but not excessively rare. It's beautiful. It doesn't oxidize or corrode. It can be melted and shaped repeatedly without losing quality. And it's dense enough that small quantities have significant value. Essentially, gold is an almost perfect engineering solution to the problem of what to use as money, and civilizations separated by oceans and millennia independently reached the same conclusion. But not every society adopted precious metals as money. In feudal Japan, rice served as the basis of the economic system for centuries. The wealth of a daimyo, feudal lord, was measured in koku of rice, the amount needed to feed one person for a year, approximately 150 kilograms. Samurai received stipends in rice. Taxes were paid in rice. Land was valued by how much rice it produced. This system had an elegant logic. It directly linked the economy to the actual capacity to sustain human lives. But it also made it vulnerable to natural disasters. A typhoon season could instantly destroy the money supply of an entire region, causing not just famine, but total economic collapse. In ancient Mesoamerica, the Aztecs used cacao seeds as money. Yes, chocolate, or rather, the beans that produce it. A small rabbit might cost about 30 cacao seeds, while a slave would cost about 100 seeds. The seeds were small, relatively uniform, durable, and crucially, impossible to counterfeit with available technology. You can't create a realistic cacao seed. Moreover, they had intrinsic value because they could be transformed into a precious beverage consumed by the elite. But this system faced an existential problem. Unlike metals, cacao seeds eventually deteriorated, and there was always the temptation to literally spend your money by consuming it. Financial self-control took on new meaning when your money was delicious. The practical problems of these first monetary systems were immense. How did you detect fraud when your money was shells, furs, or seeds? Merchants developed specialized expertise, examining each item with meticulous care. Shells were inspected for cracks, furs were checked for hidden damage, cacao beans were bitten to confirm authenticity. Each transaction required time and expertise, and when travelers arrived from distant lands with unfamiliar forms of money, commerce could stop completely while negotiators tried to establish conversion rates. A Venetian merchant arriving in China with gold florins faced exchange barriers as complex as any modern tourist navigating multiple currencies. The diversity of money forms also reflected deep cultural values. Societies that valued warriors used weapons as a measure of value. Pastoral societies used animals. Agricultural societies used grains. Maritime societies used ocean products. Money wasn't just a neutral economic tool. It was a mirror reflecting what each culture considered most important. When you choose what will be money, you're implicitly declaring what your society values above all else. And this connection between money and values continues today, although we rarely think about it. A fascinating phenomenon emerged repeatedly: ornamental money. In many cultures, objects that functioned as currency were also worn as personal adornments. Bronze bracelets in West Africa, jade necklaces in China, gold belts in Scythia, all served dual functions. This fusion had practical advantages. Your wealth was always with you, visible to all, and difficult to steal without you noticing. But it also had a social cost. Economic inequality became impossible to hide. You couldn't pretend poverty when you were literally wearing your wealth. Class structures became more rigid when economic status was constantly visible and performed through the body. Women frequently played central roles in these first monetary systems, a fact that traditional economic history often neglects. In Melanesia, it was women who created shell money. In West Africa, women controlled markets where cloth served as currency. In Southeast Asia, women managed the spice trade that determined relative values. This female economic power gradually diminished in many societies as formal monetary systems, often controlled by male-dominated institutions like temples and palaces, became dominant. The history of money is also a history of changes in gender dynamics and power. The transition from commodities to standardized currencies didn't happen smoothly or uniformly. For centuries, multiple systems coexisted and competed. In a single city, you might pay taxes in grain, buy cloth with weighed silver, and settle debts with livestock. This multiplicity created opportunities for the clever. Specialized arbitrators profited by knowing conversion rates between different forms of value, buying cheap in one system and selling dear in another. They were the first financial speculators, and they were already accumulating fortunes through manipulation of information and market asymmetries. The roots of modern finance are older, and perhaps darker, than we generally recognize. And then, sometime in the 7th century before Christ, in a region along the coast of present-day Turkey, someone had an idea that would change everything. What if, instead of weighing metal at each transaction or inspecting shells or counting seeds, we created standardized objects with guaranteed weight and purity by a trusted authority that could pass from hand to hand without question? What if we transformed money from 1,000 different forms into a single universal form? Around 640 BC, in the kingdom of Lydia, in Asia Minor, something extraordinary happened. Someone, perhaps King Alyattes, or his son, the legendary King Croesus, had the idea of creating small pieces of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver found in local rivers, with standardized weight and composition, and stamping them with the royal seal. These were the first true coins in the sense we understand today. Each piece had the same value as all others of the same denomination. You didn't need to weigh, test purity, or negotiate value at each transaction. The king's seal was a guarantee. It was essentially the first trusted brand in history, and what it sold was trust itself. Why Lydia? The region was extraordinarily rich in electrum deposits, and Sardis, its capital, was strategically positioned on trade routes connecting Greece to Persia. Merchants from dozens of different cultures passed through there, each with their own exchange systems. The inefficiency was obvious and costly. Lydian coins solved the problem all at once. A Greek merchant, a Persian trader, and an Egyptian negotiator could all agree on the value of a Lydian coin because the royal seal guaranteed its content. No mutual trust between parties was necessary, only trust in the issuing authority. This concept of a trusted third party guaranteeing value is perhaps the most important institutional innovation in economic history. But the first coins were curiously irregular. They weren't perfectly round discs like we imagine today, but small lumps of metal stamped on one side with simple images. Lion heads, bulls, seals. Each was made by hand, hammering hot metal against a mold. This meant that producing coins was laborious and expensive. Each coin carried not just material value, but also the hours of artisanal labor invested in its creation. And here was a paradox: making money cost money. Rulers had to carefully calculate whether the economic benefits of standardized currency justified the substantial production cost. The innovations spread with surprising speed. Within decades, Greek city-states were producing their own coins, each with distinct designs. Athens minted coins with owls, the symbol of Athena, its patron goddess. Corinth used Pegasus, the winged horse. These images weren't merely decorative. In an age of widespread illiteracy, the images instantly communicated the origin and therefore the presumed reliability of the coin. Coins were portable propaganda, spreading symbols and cultural values along with economic value. When you accepted an Athenian coin, you weren't just accepting silver, you were implicitly acknowledging the power and influence of Athens. The Persian Empire, under Darius III, 522–86 BC, enthusiastically adopted the monetary system, creating the gold daric and silver siglos. But the Persians took the idea one step further. They standardized coins throughout their vast empire, which extended from Egypt to India. For the first time in history, the same coin could be used in dozens of different countries, connected by thousands of kilometers. It was an ancient form of economic globalization, and it had profound effects. Long-distance trade became much more viable. Merchants could travel from Greece to India knowing their coins would be accepted all along the way, but this uniformity also consolidated imperial power. When you control money, you control the economy. Have you ever wondered how ancient rulers controlled inflation? They faced a constant dilemma. If they produced too many coins, money would lose value. If they produced too few, the economy would lack liquidity and commerce would slow. And there was always the terrible temptation to solve government financial problems through a simple trick: reduce the amount of precious metal in each coin while maintaining the same face value. This is called debasement of currency, and its effects could be devastating. When people realized that new coins had less gold or silver than old ones, they began hoarding old coins and using only new ones. Good coins disappeared from circulation, a phenomenon that economist Thomas Gresham would describe centuries later as bad money drives out good. In China, the development of coins followed a fascinatingly different path. Around 1000 BC, during the Zhou dynasty, the Chinese began casting small bronze tools, knives and spades, as primitive forms of money. Eventually, these became stylized and miniaturized, losing practical functionality but retaining their characteristic shapes. Around 350 BC, the state of Qin, which would later unify China, introduced round coins with square holes in the center. The hole allowed coins to be strung on cords for easier transport and counting. It was brilliant engineering design, and these cash coins remained essentially unchanged for more than 2,000 years, possibly the longest-lasting product design in human history. But the creation of a metal monetary system also created a new class of criminals, counterfeiters. What is a coin worth? Only the metal it contains, or what is stamped on it. If you could create counterfeit coins that looked real, you could literally manufacture wealth. Ancient governments responded with shocking brutality. In ancient Greece, counterfeiters could be executed. In China, counterfeiting coins was punishable by lingqi, death by 1,000 cuts. The severity of punishments reflected not just economic loss, but something more fundamental. Counterfeiting was seen as an attack on the very structure of society, on the trust that held everything together. And yet, despite the terrible risks counterfeiters always existed, the potential profit was simply too great. International commerce in antiquity depended crucially on coins. Alexander the Great, 336–323 BC, minted enormous quantities of gold and silver coins using treasures captured from the Persians. These Alexandrian coins spread across 3 continents, from Gibraltar to India. Long after his empire fragmented, his coins continued circulating and being accepted. Why? Because they contained reliable quantities of precious metal and were widely recognized. It was an ancient reserve currency, the equivalent of the modern American dollar. Distant cities and kingdoms maintained reserves of Alexandrian coins as protection against economic uncertainty. The idea of a global reserve currency is therefore more than 2,000 years old. The minting of coins also had profound political significance. When a new emperor took power, one of his first actions was to mint coins with his image and inscriptions proclaiming his titles and virtues. It was like an ancient social network. Each coin was a small message from the ruler to the people, asserting legitimacy and power. Usurpers who took the throne illegitimately minted coins frantically, trying to establish their authority through physical distribution of their image. And when empires fell, one of the first signs was the cessation of new coin production. Archaeologists can date the collapse of ancient governments with remarkable precision simply by the last date of coins found at a site. The silver mines at Laurion, near Athens, were crucial to Athenian power in the 5th century BC. These mines allowed Athens to mint coins in large quantities, financing its powerful navy and magnificent architectural projects, including the Parthenon. But these mines depended on slave labor. Thousands of people worked in horrific conditions in the depths of the earth, extracting the silver that would become the basis of the Athenian economy. The golden age of Athens was literally built on human suffering excavated from the ground, and this pattern would repeat throughout history. Large quantities of monetary wealth often originate in exploitation and suffering. It's an uncomfortable reality we rarely contemplate when admiring ancient coins in museums. Rome would eventually inherit and expand the Greek monetary system. The Roman denarius, introduced in 211 BC, would become the dominant coin of the Mediterranean for centuries. It was made of high-quality silver with standardized weight, approximately 4.5 grams, and had stable value for generations. A Roman soldier received about 225 denarii per year during the early empire, hence the connection between denarius and money in various languages. But the history of the denarius is also a story of gradual debasement. As imperial finances became more strained, successive emperors reduced the silver content, diluting coins with cheaper metals. The pure silver denarius of Augustus had become, by around 270 AD, a coin with less than 5% silver. It was inflation through monetary trickery, and it corroded the Roman economy from within. There is something almost magical about holding an ancient coin. This small disc of metal passed through dozens, perhaps hundreds of hands. It bought bread in Athens, paid soldiers on distant campaigns, changed hands in bustling ports. Each coin is a small testament to countless human transactions, to dreams realized and undone, to work rewarded and debt settled. And yet, for all the poetry, coins were fundamentally practical technology, perhaps the most successful technological invention of antiquity. They worked and continue to work because they solve real problems elegantly: standardization, portability, divisibility, and durability. But metal coins had limitations that would soon become apparent. They were heavy. A large transaction could require carrying kilograms of metal. They could be stolen. Bandits and pirates specialized in attacking merchants carrying coins, and the money supply was limited by the availability of precious metals. If an economy was growing rapidly but new mines weren't discovered, deflation could occur, prices falling because there wasn't enough money in circulation. Paradoxically, this could paralyze the economy because people postponed purchases, waiting for even lower prices. The physical limitations of metal coins set the limits of the economy itself. And then, emerging from the dusty roads connecting east to west, a new kind of empire was emerging. An empire that would connect China to Rome, transporting silk, spices, and ideas across thousands of kilometers. And with this trade would come a new understanding of how distant economies were interconnected, how money flowed between empires, and how the wealth of one place depended on trade with another. Rome wasn't built in a day, as the saying goes, but its economy was built on a foundation that most people never see: a complex network of taxes, trade, and monetary manipulation that kept a population of more than 60 million people connected from Britain to Mesopotamia. Imagine trying to manage the finances of a territory that extends for millions of square kilometers, speaking hundreds of languages, producing thousands of different goods, all without computers, without instant communication, without airplanes or trucks. How do you move wealth from one corner of the empire to another? How do you pay hundreds of thousands of soldiers stationed at distant borders? The Roman tax system was, in many respects, the beating heart of the empire. In the provinces, citizens paid various taxes on land, on agricultural production, sales taxes, inheritance taxes, and even taxes on slaves. Publicans, private tax collectors, bid for the right to collect taxes in specific regions, paying a fixed amount to the government and then extracting what they could from the local population. It was a system ripe for abuse. An efficient publican, from the Roman perspective, was one who extracted maximum revenue. From the perspective of the taxed, they were legalized extortionists. The New Testament mentions tax collectors alongside sinners, not by accident. They were deeply hated, seen as traitors collaborating with foreign occupiers to impoverish their own communities. Have you ever stopped to think about how much of our modern infrastructure depends on taxes? Roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, all funded by collective tribute. Rome understood this 2,000 years ago. The famous Roman roads, which extended for more than 400,000 kilometers, weren't just impressive engineering projects. They were strategic economic investments paid for with tax revenue. Better roads meant faster trade, which meant more productive economies, which meant more tax revenue. It was a virtuous cycle, not when it worked. But maintaining these roads, aqueducts, ports, and fortresses cost fortunes. And as the empire grew, administrative and military costs increased faster than the ability to generate revenue. Rome had a fascinating experiment with something like the modern welfare state. Bread and circuses, panem et circenses. The government distributed free grain to poor Roman citizens in Rome. Eventually, about 200,000 people received these regular distributions. Additionally, it funded elaborate public entertainment, chariot races, gladiator combats, theatrical performances. Why would a government do this? Cynically, to keep the urban population peaceful and distracted. But there was also an economic logic, preventing famine and social discontent that could lead to rebellions, which would cost far more to suppress than it cost to distribute grain. It was social policy, but also economic risk management. Roman trade reached extraordinary distances. Archaeologists have found Roman coins in Vietnam and India. Chinese silk adorned Roman aristocrats traveling thousands of kilometers along the Silk Road. Spices from India, ivory from Africa, amber from the Baltic. Rome imported from the entire known world. But this trade had a critical problem. The trade balance was severely unbalanced. Rome imported luxury goods in massive quantities, but exported relatively little that other civilizations wanted. The result? Roman precious metals, gold and silver, constantly flowed eastward, draining the empire's money supply. Roman historian Pliny the Elder bitterly complained that the Roman Empire was being economically drained by demand for Eastern luxury goods. This drainage of precious metals contributed to one of Rome's most serious economic crises, the 3rd century crisis AD. With the silver supply dwindling, successive emperors resorted to currency debasement, reducing the silver content in coins. The denarius, which had been nearly pure silver under Augustus, became essentially copper coins with a thin silver coating by around 270 AD. People weren't foolish, they noticed. Inflation exploded, prices could double within a matter of months. Merchants began refusing imperial coins, demanding payment in goods, or the rare full silver ancient coins. The trust in the monetary system, that invisible glue holding the economy together, was dissolving. Diocletian, 284–305 AD, attempted an audacious solution: price controls throughout the empire. His edict on maximum prices established maximum prices for more than 1,000 different goods and services, from wheat to haircuts. The penalties for violation were severe: death. It was a gigantic attempt at central economic planning, executed with imperial force. And it failed completely. Merchants simply stopped selling goods at prices that didn't cover costs. Black markets flourished, production declined. Diocletian discovered what economists would rediscover repeatedly throughout history: you cannot legislate prices away from the realities of supply and demand without creating shortages and parallel markets. The edict was silently abandoned. Rome also developed sophisticated financial systems that wouldn't reappear in Europe for 1,000 years after its fall. Roman bankers, argentari, didn't just store money but also made loans, transfers, and even operations similar to checks. You could deposit money with a banker in Rome, and your business partner could withdraw it with an associated banker in Alexandria through a letter of credit, avoiding the danger of physically transporting large sums of coins. Interest rates were regulated, generally limited to 12% per year, though they were often circumvented. And there was even something like insurance against maritime risks. These financial instruments allowed the imperial economy to function at scales that would be impossible with just physical coin transactions. Can you imagine how many jobs were created just by maintaining the monetary system? Miners extracting precious metals, mint workers producing coins, money changers converting foreign currencies, bankers managing transfers, guards protecting coin shipments, accountants recording transactions, tax officials collecting taxes. A significant portion of the imperial economy existed simply to facilitate the functioning of the economy itself. It's a phenomenon we see amplified today. Think about how many people work in banks, financial institutions, payment processing, accounting, auditing, and tax compliance. The economy of the economy can be an industry unto itself. Inflation in late Rome had devastating social effects. People on fixed incomes, including soldiers, public officials, and retirees, saw their purchasing power collapse. Lifetime savings became nearly worthless almost overnight. The Roman middle class, already under pressure, was crushed between rising taxes and devaluing coins. Many abandoned cities to live on the estates of wealthy aristocrats, offering labor in exchange for protection and subsistence. This process, called coloniatus, was a step on the path to medieval feudalism. Economic disintegration shaped social structures in ways that would last centuries. The Western Roman Empire finally fell in 476 AD, but the economic factors that contributed to its collapse had accumulated for centuries. Currency debasement, severe inflation, crushing tax rates that destroyed productivity, rising military and administrative costs, decline of trade as routes became unsafe due to invasion and civil war. When political authority finally collapsed, the economy had already fragmented largely. Coin production virtually ceased. Cities shrank drastically as trade evaporated. Western Europe entered centuries of economic decline. It's a sobering reminder: complex civilizations depend on functioning economies, and when economic systems fail, everything else can crumble with them. But Rome had a successor, the Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, which would survive for another 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantines learned from Rome's monetary mistakes. The gold solidus, introduced by Constantine the Firm in 312 AD, maintained its weight and purity remarkably stable for centuries, an anchor of monetary stability in a world of uncertainty. Merchants from 3 continents trusted the solidus. It was the dollar of its time, accepted from London to Beijing. This monetary stability helped Constantinople become the richest city in the medieval world, a center of commerce where goods from China, India, Africa, and Europe were exchanged in bustling markets. The economic history of Rome teaches us lessons that remain relevant. Governments that manipulate their currency for short-term political purposes create long-term economic problems. Uncontrolled inflation erodes social structures. Excessive taxes can be as destructive as insufficient taxes. Economic complexity requires sophisticated institutions to manage it. And perhaps most importantly, economies don't exist in isolation. They are intertwined with politics, culture, military matters, and even geography. You cannot understand the rise and fall of Rome without understanding its economy, and you cannot understand its economy without understanding everything else about how Romans lived, governed, and saw the world. And while Rome was shaping the West in the East, something even more extraordinary was happening. Trade routes that would connect civilizations, spread religions, and stretch across relentless deserts and deadly mountain passages, routes that would carry not just merchandise, but ideas, art, and the very seeds of globalization. Close your eyes and imagine you are in a caravan of camels crossing the Taklamakan Desert, one of the most inhospitable regions on Earth. For days, all you see is sand and sky. The temperature during the day can exceed 50 degrees Celsius. At night, it can drop below 0. Your life depends on knowing exactly where the oases are, water sources separated by journeys of several days. You carry silk from Xi'an, spices from Khwarezm, and lapis lazuli from Badakhshan. If you survive this journey almost avoiding bandits, sandstorms, and dehydration, you can profit the equivalent of several years' wages. But many don't survive. That was the price of connecting civilizations, the true cost of ancient globalization. The Silk Road wasn't a single road, but a complex network of land and sea routes connecting China to the Mediterranean, covering more than 6,000 kilometers. The name is misleading. Far more than silk was traded. Chinese porcelain traveled west. Roman glass traveled east. Indian spices, Central Asian horses, Chinese paper and gunpowder, precious metals from everywhere. It was a truly global exchange of goods, But even more significant was the exchange of ideas. Buddhism traveled from India to China along these routes. Islam spread through Central Asia. Technologies like papermaking and gunpowder migrated from China to the West, changing the course of human history. What made silk so extraordinarily valuable? It was partly its material quality: light, strong, luxurious to the touch, and capable of being dyed in vibrant colors. But it was also its mystery. For centuries, only the Chinese knew how to produce silk, guarding the secret vigorously. Sericulture, the raising of silkworms, it was protected state knowledge. Exporting silkworms or eggs outside China was punishable by death. This monopoly kept prices astronomically high. At the height of the Roman Empire, silk was literally worth its weight in gold. Wealthy Romans wore it to demonstrate supreme status, sometimes scandalizing conservative moralists who thought fine fabrics were decadent and revealing. Around the 6th century AD, as legend tells, 2 Christian monks smuggled silkworm eggs out of China, hidden inside bamboo staffs. This broke the Chinese monopoly, allowing silk production in Constantinople. It was one of the first examples of successful industrial espionage, and it had profound economic consequences. Silk prices fell as supply increased. The wealth that had constantly flowed from Europe to China diminished. Entire economies in Central Asia, which depended on intermediating silk trade, were disrupted. It's a reminder, economic secrets are difficult to keep permanently, and when they are revealed, entire markets can transform. The oasis cities along the Silk Road were economic phenomena in themselves. Places like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar were vital stopping points where caravans rested, resupplied, and crucially, exchanged goods and information. These cities didn't produce many famous goods, but they prospered by being intermediaries, charging fees, providing services, facilitating exchanges. They were ancient financial centers, their wealth derived entirely from their strategic geographic position. Merchants from dozens of cultures mingled in these bazaars, speaking the lingua franca of commerce, negotiating not just goods, but news from distant lands. The price of wheat in Rome could affect decisions in Xi'an, transmitted through this network of merchants. Have you ever considered how exchange rates worked in a world where each region had its own currency? A merchant traveling from Constantinople to Chang'an would pass through dozens of different political domains, each with its own coinage. Specialized money changers established shops in trading cities with complex tables of conversion rates, a kind of mental spreadsheet before spreadsheets existed. These people needed to know not just the metal content of various coins, but their relative acceptability in different markets. It was highly valuable specialized knowledge, and the best money changers accumulated considerable fortunes. They were essentially primitive international bankers facilitating transcontinental trade. The maritime routes of the Maritime Silk Road were equally important, though less romanticized. Ships sailed from southern China through the Strait of Malacca, along the coast of India, through the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea, eventually reaching Mediterranean ports. These ships carried heavier cargo than land caravans could: porcelain, iron, textiles in quantity. But maritime navigation had its own dangers: storms that could sink entire fleets, pirates in lawless waters, diseases that spread rapidly in confined spaces. Primitive insurers emerged where groups of merchants would pool risks. If one ship out of 10 was lost, the owners of the 9 survivors would share the loss. It was simple mathematics but effective, the first marine insurance. The most valuable spice traded wasn't pepper or cinnamon, but something far more modest: salt. Wait, didn't we talk about salt before? Yes, but its role in long-distance trade deserves renewed emphasis. Salt was vital for preserving food in an era before refrigeration. Without it, meat and fish would deteriorate in days. With it, they could last months or years. Control of salt routes was direct economic power. The Sahara, despite its deadly hostility, was regularly crossed by caravans transporting salt bars south and gold north. Cities like Timbuktu thrived on trans-Saharan trade, becoming centers of learning and wealth. Salt literally was worth its weight in gold in some regions. Here's an uncomfortable question. How much human suffering was the foundation of this glorious trade? Slaves were an important commodity along many ancient trade routes. The Silk Road transported enslaved people, along with porcelain and spices. Trans-Saharan trade was as much about slave trading as about salt and gold. The Indian Ocean saw centuries of slave trade long before Europeans began the transatlantic trade. Wealth was often built on exploitation, and ancient economic systems, despite their sophistication in some respects, were often based on the fundamental denial of humanity to many people. It's an aspect of economic history that should not be romanticized or ignored. Long-distance trade also spread diseases on devastating scales. The plague of Justinian, 541–549 AD, which killed possibly half the population of the Byzantine Empire, probably traveled along trade routes from China or India. The Black Death, 1347–1353, which would kill a third of Europe's population, arrived via merchants on the Silk Road. Globalization means not just exchanges of goods and ideas, but also of pathogens. Populations without prior immunity could be decimated, and, cynically, these plagues had profound economic effects. Labor shortages led to higher wages for survivors, disrupting feudal social structures. Tragedy and economic transformation frequently walk hand in hand. Navigation through these routes required extraordinary technical knowledge. How do you navigate through deserts without landmarks or oceans without GPS? Merchants developed sophisticated methods: reading stars, knowledge of wind patterns, memorization of geographic landmarks. The Arabs developed the astrolabe and sextant for maritime navigation. The Chinese invented the magnetic compass, which would revolutionize maritime navigation. These technological advances were driven by economic necessity, the desire to trade farther, faster, more safely. Technological innovation and economic ambition have been partners throughout history. The Silk Road began to decline in the 15th century for multiple reasons. The Mongol Empire, which had unified much of the route under a single political domain, greatly facilitating trade, fragmented. Political instability made the routes dangerous. The rise of the Ottoman Empire created intermediaries who charged heavy fees. Simultaneously, improvements in maritime navigation made ocean routes more attractive. You could transport more goods faster with fewer intermediary fees. The European age of discovery was largely motivated by the desire to bypass the Silk Road and its expensive intermediaries, accessing Asian wealth directly. The pursuit of economic profitability would drive explorers to cross unknown oceans, with consequences that would reshape the entire world. But there was another lesser-known trade network that deserves mention: the trans-African trade routes that connected the Swahili coast on the Indian Ocean with inland kingdoms like Great Zimbabwe. Gold, ivory, and slaves were transported to the coast and exchanged for cloth, beads, and Chinese porcelain. Yes, Chinese porcelain in Zimbabwe ruins. Trade truly was global. These networks were as sophisticated as any in Eurasia, but are often neglected in dominant historical narratives. Economic history, like all history, has biases about which stories are told and which are forgotten. What does trade along the Silk Road teach us about economics today? That trade creates interdependence. When nations trade, they become invested in each other's success. That intermediaries can be extraordinarily profitable, but also vulnerable to being bypassed by innovation. That knowledge and information are valuable commodities in themselves. That globalization brings both benefits and risks, connecting markets but also spreading crises. And that geography is destiny until technology overcomes it. Constantinople prospered because of its location between Europe and Asia. Venice dominated because it controlled trade choke points. But when the Portuguese discovered maritime routes around Africa, the economic map of the world changed forever. And while bold merchants connected continents through mountains and oceans, in China an invention was being developed that would completely transform the very nature of money. An invention that Europeans wouldn't adopt for another half-millennium, but which would allow economies to operate on previously impossible scales. During the Tang dynasty, around the 7th century AD, Chinese merchants faced a growing problem. Their transactions were becoming so large that the physical weight of coins was impractical. Imagine needing to transport the equivalent of 1,000 bronze coins to buy a shipment of silk. These coins would weigh dozens of kilograms. You would need an entire cart just to transport your money. It was absurd, impractical, and dangerous. Bandits knew that merchants carrying large quantities of coins were lucrative targets. So merchants began to develop an ingenious solution. They deposited their heavy coins with trusted agents and received written receipts on paper, promising the return of coins upon presentation. These receipts, called fei qian, or flying money, were revolutionary. You could travel hundreds of kilometers carrying only a few pieces of paper instead of metal coffers. When you reached your destination, you would present the receipt to a corresponding agent and receive local coins. It was essentially a banking transfer system, operating through a network of trust between merchants and banking houses. But there was a problem. These receipts were private, issued by individual commercial entities. Their value depended entirely on the reputation and solvency of the issuer. If the banking house failed, its receipts became worthless paper. The government of the Song dynasty, 960–1279 AD, saw both the opportunity and the danger in these private arrangements. Around 1024 AD, the government began issuing the first true government-backed paper currency, the jiaozi. Initially, it was convertible. You could exchange it for metal coins on demand. But here was the magic. As long as people trusted they could convert it, most didn't. The paper circulated as money in its own right. The Song government discovered something profound. Money is ultimately a system of trust. If people believe that a piece of paper has value, then it has value, even if it's intrinsically just cellulose and ink. Have you ever held a dollar bill and really thought about what it is? It's a piece of paper with numbers and symbols printed on it. Its intrinsic value is almost zero, and yet you would trade hours of your work for these pieces of paper without hesitation. Why? Because you trust that other people will accept them too. That's the same insight the Song Chinese had 1,000 years ago. They realized that money doesn't need to have intrinsic value, it needs to have collectively agreed upon value. It was an abstraction at a higher level than even metal coins. At least gold and silver had some material value. Paper money was pure institutional trust materialized. But this abstraction also opened dangerous possibilities. If money is just paper, why not print more when you need it? The Song dynasty faced exactly that temptation. Wars with nomadic neighbors to the north were expensive. Maintaining the imperial bureaucracy was expensive. Instead of raising taxes, politically unpopular, or cutting spending, practically difficult, they simply printed more paper money. Initially, it worked. Government spending increased without immediate resistance. But gradually, people realized that more paper was circulating without a corresponding increase in goods and services. Prices began to rise. Inflation, that ancient plague, returned with new force. By the end of the Song dynasty, inflation had become severe. Paper money that could buy a sack of rice now bought only a handful. People lost confidence in government notes and tried to return to metal coins or direct barter. The government responded by making it mandatory to accept paper money under penalty of punishment. But you cannot legislate trust. Merchants found ways to circumvent the rules, charging different prices for payment in paper versus metal. Black markets flourished. It was a lesson that would be painfully relearned throughout history. Once trust in a currency is destroyed, restoring it is extraordinarily difficult. The Yuan dynasty, established by Mongol conquerors under Kublai Khan (1260–1294), initially maintained the paper money system, but with brutal rigor. Refusing to accept imperial paper money was punishable by death. Kublai Khan understood that paper money gave the government tremendous power, the ability to mobilize resources simply by printing notes. Marco Polo, the famous Phoenician traveler who visited Kublai Khan's court, was amazed by the system. He wrote about how the Khan makes his money from something that costs nothing, essentially creating wealth from nothing. But Marco Polo didn't stay long enough to see the system collapse under exactly the same inflation that had destroyed Song currency. When the Ming overthrew the yuan in 1368, they initially continued with paper money, but repeated their predecessors' mistakes. Excessive printing led to inflation. By around 1450, China had largely abandoned paper money, returning to silver coins. The experiment was over, temporarily. It would take centuries before paper money was attempted again on a large scale, and when it was, it would be under very different circumstances. China had discovered paper money, pioneered its use, and learned its pitfalls, all while Europe was still using exclusively metal coins. Meanwhile, in the medieval Islamic world, sophisticated financial systems were emerging that avoided some of the pitfalls of paper money while retaining many of its benefits. The sak, from which the word check comes, was a financial instrument that allowed a merchant in Baghdad to issue a payment order that could be cashed in Cordoba. It was like a modern check, but functioning through a network of Muslim merchants linked by religious and commercial ties that extended from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Trust came not from government guarantee, but from personal and community reputation. The Islamic world also developed hawala, a system of value transfer that still exists today. It works like this. You want to send money from Damascus to Delhi. You pay a hawala agent in Damascus who contacts a correspondent in Delhi who pays the recipient. No physical money crosses borders. The debt between the two agents is settled later through business transactions or occasional transfers. It's based entirely on trust and reputation. It's remarkably efficient, with minimal fees and speed that modern banking systems often cannot match. And it works without government, without formal regulation, just interpersonal trust and social pressure to honor obligations. Think about how concepts of debt and credit are abstract. When you use a credit card today, no money physically moves at the moment of transaction. Numbers are adjusted in databases. The debt exists purely as information recorded electronically. Medieval Islamic merchants were operating conceptually similar systems, using parchment and messengers instead of computers and satellites. Technology changes, but the fundamental principles of credit, debt, and trust remain surprisingly consistent across millennia. In feudal Japan, meanwhile, a unique system was emerging. Regional domains, Achan, sometimes issued their own promissory notes, essentially local paper money. These notes were often backed by rice reserves. You could theoretically exchange the note for a specific amount of rice. It was a hybrid between commodity money and fiat, combining the intrinsic value of rice with the convenience of paper. But it created problems when people tried to use these notes outside their domain of origin. There was no national standardization, so Japan's money was a patchwork of hundreds of local systems, each with different values and reliability. The technology of paper-making itself was crucial for making paper money viable. Paper needs to be durable enough to circulate repeatedly without disintegrating, but also difficult to counterfeit. The Chinese developed sophisticated techniques, using specific fibers, adding watermarks, employing multiple colors of ink, incorporating silk threads. Each note was essentially a small work of art and engineering. Counterfeiters existed, of course, and the punishments were brutal, usually death by beheading or worse. The severity reflected the perceived danger. Counterfeiting wasn't just theft, it was an attack on the social order itself. Why didn't Europe adopt paper money for so long after China? Part of the reason was distrust of central governments. Medieval Europe was fragmented into numerous competing monarchies, duchies, and city-states. There was no tradition of unified imperial authority that China had. The trust necessary to make paper money work, trust that a distant government would honor its notes, simply didn't exist. Europeans trusted what they could touch and weigh, gold and silver. It would take financial crises in the 17th century before Europeans seriously experimented with paper money, and even then, with deep hesitation and multiple failures. Paper money also raises unsettling philosophical questions. What is real wealth? If a government can create money by printing paper, is all wealth illusory? Chinese philosophers debated this. Some argued that real wealth consisted of tangible goods, food, clothing, tools. Money, whether metal or paper, was just a convenient intermediary. Others argued that money itself was real because it represented crystallized human labor and social trust. These debates mirror modern discussions about cryptocurrencies and central banks. The fundamental questions about the nature of money remain surprisingly unanswered, even after millennia of experience. And while China experimented with monetary abstraction, Europe was about to enter its own period of economic transformation. Italian city-states were developing banking systems that would finance the Renaissance and lay the foundations for modern capitalism. Money was about to become not just a medium of exchange, but a driving force shaping art, politics, and the very structure of society. Florence, in the 14th century, was a city of contradictions. Magnificent churches dominated the skyline, built with money from banking families that the church officially condemned. Medieval Christian doctrine prohibited usury, lending money at interest, considering it sinful. Thomas Aquinas argued that charging interest was unnatural, like trying to sell time, which belonged only to God. And yet Florence and other Italian cities were becoming the banking centers of Europe, accumulating fortunes through, exactly, loans with interest. How did they reconcile this contradiction with considerable accounting creativity and convenient hypocrisy? Italian bankers developed elaborate techniques to disguise interest. Instead of lending 100 ducats and expecting 110 in return, obvious 10% interest, they would structure transactions as currency exchanges. Lending 100 ducats in Florence to be repaid with 110 in London in a different currency could be justified as an exchange rate and risk compensation, not usury. Or they would call it profit participation instead of interest. Clergy pretended not to notice, especially when the same banking families were financing magnificent cathedrals and charitable works. It was a mutually convenient arrangement. Bankers profited, the church gained generous patrons, and everyone agreed not to examine the mechanisms too closely. The Medici family of Florence exemplified the rise of banking power. Starting as a modest banking house in the 14th century, they eventually became the richest family in Europe, financing kings, popes, and commercial empires. How? By developing a sophisticated banking network with branches in major European cities. They facilitated international trade by providing letters of credit. They lent to governments, always risky, but potentially lucrative. They developed double-entry bookkeeping, which allowed precise tracking of complex assets and liabilities. Cosimo de' Medici famously said, "We have many friends and we acquired them with our money." It was economic power translating directly into political influence. Have you ever thought about how banks really make money? The basic principle is remarkably simple: borrow cheap and lend expensive. Banks accept deposits for which they pay little or no interest and then lend that money at higher rates. The difference, the spread, is profit. But there is an inherent fragility in this model. Banks lend money for long periods, 30-year mortgages, multi-year business loans, but must be able to return deposits on demand. This works only because not all depositors demand their money back at the same time. It's based on probability and trust. When trust wavers and everyone demands their deposits simultaneously, a bank run, even healthy banks can collapse. The city-state of Venice developed some of the most innovative financial institutions of the Middle Ages. The Banco di Rialto, established in 1587, though earlier banking systems existed, was essentially a public bank, where merchants maintained accounts and transfers were executed by adjusting ledger entries. You could pay someone simply by instructing the bank to transfer funds from your account to theirs, without physical coins changing hands. It was digital money centuries before computing. And because these transactions were recorded in official books, they served as enforceable contracts. Venice's banking system was so reliable that Banco di Scritta, bank credit, sometimes was worth more than physical coins because it was safer and more convenient. The concept of fractional reserve banking emerged gradually. Bankers realized that most depositors didn't withdraw their money simultaneously, so it was safe to lend out most of the deposits while keeping only a fraction in reserve. This dramatically increased lending capacity and therefore profits. But it also meant that the banking system as a whole had claims on far more money than actually existed. It was a form of financial magic. Multiple people could legitimately claim ownership of the same money. This made the banking system incredibly productive, financing trade and enterprises that would otherwise be impossible, but it also made it vulnerable to panics. The rise of sovereign government debt transformed European finance. Governments always needed to borrow. Wars are expensive. But in the past, loans were often short-term and personal, from monarchs to individual bankers. The innovation was creating negotiable debt, bonds that could be bought and sold. The Dutch pioneered this in the 16th century, issuing government obligations that paid regular interest and could be traded in secondary markets. This transformed debt from a personal relationship into a commodity. You could invest in the debts of governments, trade them when you needed liquidity, and even speculate on the solvency of nations. An entire market emerged around buying and selling government debt. This raises a curious question. Is debt good or bad? We often think of it negatively. Being in debt seems like a weakness. But from an economic perspective, debt is a tool. It allows individuals and governments to consume or invest now using future resources. A farmer can borrow to buy seeds, plant them, and repay the loan after harvest with profit. Without access to credit, he would be trapped in subsistence. Governments can borrow to build infrastructure that drives economic growth, increasing future tax revenues. The problem isn't debt itself, but unproductive debt, borrowing for consumption that generates no future return. This distinction is crucial but often forgotten. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, founded in 1602, was the first publicly traded corporation in the world. Investors could buy shares, essentially pieces of ownership in the company, that were traded on the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. This allowed the VOC to raise enormous capital by distributing risk among many investors. If the company prospered, shareholders profited. If it failed, losses were shared. It was an institutional innovation that enabled enterprises of previously impossible scale. The VOC would operate for nearly 200 years, becoming one of the richest and most powerful entities in the world, effectively governing territories and waging wars. But the VOC also exemplifies the darker sides of nascent capitalism. It trafficked in slaves on a massive scale. It used brutal violence to establish trade monopolies. It exploited resources and people throughout Asia. Its pursuit of profit left little room for humanitarian considerations. And shareholders in Amsterdam, collecting dividends, were insulated from the bloody realities of how these profits were generated. This disconnect between owners of capital and the real consequences of capital's activities remains a defining feature of the modern economy. The South Sea bubble of 1720 and the contemporary Mississippi bubble in France demonstrated the dangers of rampant speculation. The South Sea Company promised fantastic profits from trade with Spanish America. Stock prices soared vertiginously as speculators rushed to buy. People from all social classes invested their savings, hoping to get rich. But the promised profits were largely illusory. When reality set in, the bubble burst. Stock prices collapsed, fortunes evaporated, lives were ruined. Isaac Newton, who lost considerable money in the bubble, supposedly said, "I can calculate the motion of celestial bodies, but not the madness of people." Why do people repeatedly fall into speculative bubbles? Psychology. When we see others getting rich, we experience FOMO, fear of missing out. Rationality goes out the window. We convince ourselves that this time is different, that we understand something others don't. This psychology hasn't changed in 300 years. We saw it in the dot-com bubble in 2000. We saw it in subprime mortgages in 2008. We see it in various assets today. Technology changes, but human psychology of greed and fear remains constant. And economies suffer when speculation replaces real productivity as the engine of growth. The Industrial Revolution beginning in the late 18th century was as much a financial revolution as a technological one. Factories required massive upfront capital: buildings, machinery, raw materials. Bank loans and stock markets made this possible. Entrepreneurs could gather money from multiple sources, build operations at scale, and then repay investors with profits. Without sophisticated financial institutions, the Industrial Revolution couldn't have happened. Technology alone isn't enough. You need capital to implement it. And capital requires functioning financial institutions that channel savings into productive investments. The gold standard emerged as the dominant monetary system in the 19th century. Coins were backed by and convertible into gold at fixed rates. This imposed discipline on governments. You couldn't simply print unlimited money because you needed gold to back it. But it was also rigid. When economies grew faster than the gold supply, deflation occurred, making debts more burdensome and potentially causing recessions. The debate between commodity-backed currencies versus fiat money, unsupported by precious metals, continues today, reflecting fundamental tensions between stability and flexibility, between discipline and discretion. Banking and financial systems became the invisible infrastructure of modern civilization. We tend to think of infrastructure as physical: roads, bridges, electrical grids. But financial infrastructure, banks, stock markets, payment systems, is equally essential. When it functions smoothly, we barely notice it. But when it collapses, as in 2008, the consequences ricochet through all of society. Perhaps the question isn't whether we should have complex financial systems, but how we design them to be resilient, fair, and serving human welfare rather than just private profit. And while banks and stock exchanges were transforming Europe, across the Atlantic, new nations were being born, experimenting with their own ways of organizing economies and societies. A young American republic would soon learn that establishing a stable currency and trustworthy financial systems was as crucial as winning independence on the battlefield. When the 13 American colonies declared independence in 1776, they faced an acute financial problem: how to pay for a war against the most powerful empire in the world without an established tax system or gold reserves. The solution was to print paper money called continentals. The Continental Congress simply printed notes, promising they would be convertible into silver or gold coins someday in the future. Initially, it worked. Merchants and soldiers accepted continentals as payment. But as the war dragged on and more paper was printed without corresponding backing, inflation exploded. By around 1781, continentals had become practically worthless. The phrase, "not worth a continental," entered American lexicon, meaning something completely useless. Soldiers of the Continental Army were sometimes paid with coins that barely bought a meal. Imagine risking your life in battle and being compensated with paper that merchants rejected. The experience traumatized the American founding generation, making them deeply distrustful of paper money unsupported by metal. This distrust would shape American monetary policy for generations. Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, understood that establishing financial credibility was fundamental to the young nation's survival. In 1790, he proposed that the federal government assume all state debts accumulated during the Revolution and pay them in full. It was controversial. Why should states that had been fiscally responsible pay for the debts of states that weren't? But Hamilton argued that establishing that the United States would honor its debts was essential for accessing credit markets in the future. His approach worked. Domestic and foreign investors began to see American bonds as safe investments. Trust, once established, allowed the federal government to borrow at reasonable rates. Hamilton also argued for the creation of a central bank, the first bank of the United States, modeled partly on the Bank of England. It would be a public-private bank that would issue a uniform national currency, lend to the government, and regulate credit. But the idea was deeply divisive. Thomas Jefferson and others saw it as a dangerous consolidation of power, benefiting northern financial interests at the expense of southern farmers. The debate over the first bank reflected fundamental tensions in American democracy: centralization versus states' rights, agriculture versus commerce, populism versus elitism. The bank was established in 1791, but its charter was not renewed in 1811, partly due to these political anxieties. American experience with money in the 19th century was chaotic. After the expiration of the Second Bank of the United States in 1836, the U.S. entered the era of free banking. State and even private banks issued their own notes. There were literally thousands of different currencies circulating, each with questionable value and reliability. You might receive payment in notes from a bank in Ohio and discover that merchants in New York would accept them only at great discount, or wouldn't accept them at all. It was a nightmare for commerce. Voluminous guides published tables listing hundreds of bank currencies and their current exchange rates and reliability. It was barter with added complexity. Wildcat banks, so called, because they supposedly established branches in remote locations where only wildcats lived, were particularly problematic. They would issue notes far beyond their capacity to redeem, hoping that note holders would never actually travel to their inconvenient locations to demand conversion to specie. When they inevitably failed, note holders were left with worthless paper. The free banking era was, in many ways, the Wild West of finance. Maximum freedom, but also widespread chaos and fraud. It was a demonstration that purely free markets without regulation can produce suboptimal results, to say the least. The American Civil War, 1861-1865, forced another round of monetary innovation. The Union government faced astronomical war costs. In 1862, it began issuing greenback, paper dollars not convertible into gold or silver. They were pure fiat money, worth something only because the government declared them legal tender and would accept them in payment of taxes. Surprisingly, it worked reasonably well. Inflation occurred, but was manageable compared to the continental disaster. This demonstrated that fiat money could work if backed by a sufficiently strong and trustworthy government. The Confederacy also printed paper money, but suffered devastating hyperinflation as its military position deteriorated. Another example of how trust in currency reflects trust in the issuer. Think about how war and money are intertwined throughout history. Wars are incredibly expensive, forcing governments to innovate financially. Taxes are invented or increased, debts are issued, paper money is printed, economic controls are imposed. Many of our modern financial institutions, from income tax to the Federal Reserve, originated from wartime necessities. War accelerates economic change because failure has existential consequences. It's a sobering reminder that much economic progress has emerged from human conflict and bloodshed. The National Banking Act of 1863 brought some order to monetary chaos, creating standardized national currencies issued by federally chartered banks. But financial panics continued. 1873, 1893, 1907, each bringing bank collapses, massive unemployment, and suffering. The Panic of 1907 was particularly severe. Only the intervention of J.P. Morgan, who organized private bankers to provide emergency liquidity, prevented total collapse. But it became clear that depending on a private individual to save the national financial system was unsustainable. This provided momentum to create a formal central bank. The Federal Reserve was established in 1913 as the Central Bank of the United States. Its mission: stabilize the financial system, prevent panics, manage the money supply. It was a typically American compromise, not a single central bank, but a system of 12 regional banks overseen by a board in Washington. It reflected persistent American distrust of centralized authority. The Fed could lend to banks facing runs, the function of lender of last resort, expand or contract the money supply, and adjust interest rates to influence economic activity. It was and remains one of the most powerful institutions in the world. Though few ordinary citizens understand how it works or why it matters. The gold standard, which had governed the international monetary system through the 19th century, began to erode during World War I. Countries suspended convertibility to print enough money to finance massive war efforts. After the war, attempts to return to the gold standard failed disastrously. Britain returned to pre-war parity in 1925, but the pound was overvalued, making British exports uncompetitive and causing severe unemployment. The Great Depression of the 1930s delivered the final blow. Countries that abandoned the gold standard early recovered faster than those that clung to it. The rigidity that had been gold's strength, preventing governments from irresponsibly inflating, became a weakness in times of economic depression when monetary flexibility was needed. The Great Depression, 1929-1939, was the defining economic event of the 20th century. Stock values collapsed. Banks failed by the thousands. Unemployment reached 25% in the US. Families lost homes and farms. Shantytowns emerged on the edges of cities. How did this happen? A combination of speculative bubbles, easy credit, trade protectionism, monetary policy mistakes, and bank panics, but the scale of suffering demonstrated that economic depressions weren't just technical fluctuations, they were humanitarian catastrophes requiring political response. This led to the New Deal in the US and expansion of social safety nets across Western democracies. John Maynard Keynes argued that severe depressions required active government intervention. When private demand collapses, the government should increase spending to compensate, even if it means running deficits. It was heresy to classical economists who believed in balanced budgets. But Keynesian policies seemed to work. The New Deal, while not entirely ending the Depression, provided relief and reformed capitalism to make it more stable and equitable. World War II, with its massive government spending, finally ended the Depression, a grim validation of Keynesian economics. Keynes fundamentally changed how we think about the government's role in economies, a debate that continues fiercely today. The Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 established a new international monetary system. Currencies would be fixed to the American dollar, and the dollar would be convertible into gold at $35 per ounce. This effectively made the dollar the world's reserve currency. For this structure to work, the US needed to maintain monetary discipline and accept special responsibilities. The Bretton Woods system facilitated the post-war economic boom, rapid growth, trade expansion, reconstruction of Europe and Japan. but it contained contradictions. As foreign economies grew, they accumulated dollars while US gold reserves were finite. Eventually, there wouldn't be enough gold to support all the dollars in global circulation. In 1971, President Nixon closed the gold window, ending the dollar's convertibility into gold. It was the end of the gold standard, now definitively. Currencies would float freely against each other, determined by markets. It was the beginning of the era of fully fiat money. Money worth something simply because government said so without backing by commodities. Many predicted disaster. But the system, though imperfect and often unstable, survived. We still live under this regime today. Money became pure information and trust, untethered to physical substances like gold. It's the culmination of a process of abstraction that began with the first Lydian coins more than 2,600 years ago. And then, in the 21st century, something unprecedented emerged. Money not issued by governments. Money that existed only as entries in distributed ledgers. Money created by mathematical algorithms. The implications are still unfolding, but clearly we are at yet another inflection point in the long history of human money. Imagine waking up in New York, checking the stock price of Toyota in Tokyo, transferring funds to an account in Switzerland, buying coffee grown in Ethiopia via an online seller in France, all before breakfast. This level of global economic integration would have seemed like sorcery to someone just a century ago. Financial globalization, the integration of financial markets across national borders, has accelerated dramatically since the 1980s. Capital now flows around the world at the speed of light through fiber optic cables, seeking the best returns. But this capital mobility has both costs and benefits. The creation of the euro in 1999 was an extraordinary experiment. 19 European countries sharing a single currency, but maintaining separate governments. The logic was that a common currency would eliminate transaction costs, facilitate trade, and strengthen political integration. And it worked to some extent. Intra-European trade increased. Traveling through Europe became more convenient, but the European sovereign debt crisis of 2010-2012 exposed fundamental flaws. Countries like Greece couldn't devalue their currencies or print money to manage crises, tools that countries with their own currencies retained. They were trapped between painful austerity or leaving the euro entirely. A common currency without common fiscal union created tensions that continue to challenge Europe. The 2008 financial crisis was the most severe economic disruption since the Great Depression. It originated in American subprime mortgages, loans to borrowers with weak credit that were packaged into complex securities and sold globally. When house prices stopped rising and defaults increased, these securities became toxic assets. Banks holding them faced insolvency. Lehman Brothers, one of the largest investment banks in the US, failed. Credit markets froze. The global economy went into freefall. Only massive government interventions, bank bailouts, stimulus spending, monetary easing, prevented complete collapse. Why did the 2008 crisis happen? Multiple factors: loose regulation allowing excessive risk-taking, complex financial models that obscured risks, conflicts of interest between rating agencies and issuers, greed and misaligned incentives on Wall Street. But fundamentally, it was a failure to recognize that interconnected financial systems can amplify shocks. When too big to fail became reality, it created moral hazard. Institutions taking reckless risks, knowing they would be bailed out. The consequences? Unemployment, foreclosures, austerity, were borne disproportionately by ordinary people, not the financial executives whose decisions caused the disaster. This injustice fuels distrust of financial institutions to this day. Have you ever wondered why financial crises seem to occur regularly? There's a pattern. Periods of growth generate optimism, which leads to increasing risk-taking, which eventually becomes unsustainable, triggering a crisis, which leads to stricter regulation and caution until memories fade and the cycle begins again. It's called the boom-bust cycle, and it occurs because human psychology oscillates between greed and fear. Regulators and market participants are often fighting the last crisis, not anticipating the next one. And there are always new financial instruments, derivatives, credit swaps, promising to manage risk, but often just disguising it until it explodes in unexpected ways. Cryptocurrencies, initiated with Bitcoin in 2009, represent a fundamental critique of traditional monetary systems. Bitcoin was created in response to the financial crisis, based on distrust of central banks and governments. It's decentralized money, with no controlling authority, governed by mathematical algorithms and maintained by a peer-to-peer network. Proponents argue it's a hedge against inflation and financial censorship, returning monetary power to individuals. Critics point to extreme volatility, use in illegal activities, astronomical energy consumption for mining, and questions about whether something with no intrinsic value or government backing can really be money. The blockchain technology underlying Bitcoin is perhaps more revolutionary than Bitcoin itself. It's a distributed, tamper-proof ledger with no central authority. This has potential applications far beyond currency: supply chain tracking, property records, smart contracts that execute automatically. Or it could be mostly hype, a solution looking for problems, as some argue. What's clear is that we're exploring again the fundamental questions. What is money? Who should control it? How do we balance privacy and transparency, freedom and regulation? These are the same questions the Sumerians asked 5,000 years ago, just with different technology. Wealth inequality has reached levels unseen since the Gilded Age of the late 19th century. The richest 1% owns an increasing percentage of global wealth. Is this an inevitable result of capitalism or specific policies and regulation? Thomas Piketty, in his book Capital in the 21st Century, argues that when the rate of return on capital exceeds the rate of economic growth, wealth naturally concentrates. Inheritances amplify inequalities between generations. This has economic consequences. It reduces demand because the rich spend a smaller proportion of their income, and political ones, extreme inequality, can undermine democracy when the rich translate economic power into political power, shaping rules in their favor. Digital payments have transformed how we transact. Credit cards, electronic transfers, mobile payment apps. Physical money is becoming obsolete in many societies. In China, mobile payments via WeChat Pay and Alipay are ubiquitous. Even beggars sometimes display QR codes. In Sweden, many businesses no longer accept physical money. This brings efficiency, faster transactions, reduced costs, better tracking, but also concerns: surveillance, every transaction traceable; exclusion, what about those without smartphones or bank accounts; vulnerability, hackers and system failures; and corporate power, private tech companies mediating increasingly more economic exchanges. Central banks now contemplate CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. These would be digital money issued directly by central banks, not by commercial banks. This could fundamentally transform the banking system. If citizens could maintain accounts directly with the central bank, what would be the role of commercial banks? CBDCs could improve monetary policy implementation, reduce transaction costs, and increase financial inclusion. But they also raise questions about privacy and government control. A government could theoretically track and even control every transaction of its citizens. The balance between efficiency and freedom is delicate. Global debt, governmental, corporate, and household combined, has reached unprecedented levels, well above 300% of global GDP. Is it sustainable? It depends. Countries that issue debt in their own currencies, like the US, Japan, United Kingdom, can theoretically always pay by printing money, though this risks inflation. Countries that borrow in foreign currencies can face sovereign debt crises when they can't pay, but high debt limits policy flexibility. When the next crisis hits, already heavily indebted governments will have less fiscal room to respond. It's a built-in vulnerability in our global economic system. Climate change presents profound economic risks often underestimated by financial markets. Extreme weather events destroy property and infrastructure. Temperature changes affect agriculture and productivity. Rising sea levels threaten coastal cities containing trillions in asset value. Transitions from fossil fuels will create stranded assets, oil and coal reserves that become worthless if they can't be burned. Some argue we're in a carbon bubble that will eventually burst, potentially triggering financial crisis. Financial systems built on time horizons of years or decades struggle to price risks that unfold over generations. Can you imagine what money will be like in 50 years? Will we still have physical money, or will it be purely digital? Will it be controlled by governments, corporations, or decentralized networks? Will we have national currencies or truly global systems? The only certainty is that it will change. It changed dramatically in the last 50 years and the 50 before that, and so on throughout history. Each era finds its monetary system natural and permanent, but all have been merely temporary. We're always in the middle of transition, though we rarely notice it while it's happening. And while we contemplate possible futures, it's worth reflecting on what we've learned through this long journey from barter to Bitcoin. Because the history of money isn't really about coins or paper money or cryptocurrencies. It's about how human beings cooperate, trust, compete, and organize societies. It's about our continuous attempts to solve the fundamental problem of how to distribute scarce resources among billions of people with unlimited wants. Answer honestly, if you lost $100, would you feel worse than you would feel good winning $100? For most people, the answer is yes. Losses hurt psychologically more than equivalent gains feel good. This is called loss aversion, and it's just one of many ways our psychology deviates from the perfect rationality that traditional economic models assume. For decades, economists built theories assuming people are rational actors, coldly calculating costs and benefits. But psychologists like Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky demonstrated that real human beings are consistently irrational in predictable ways. This gave rise to behavioral economics, which integrates psychology into economic analysis. Consider the anchoring effect. If I ask whether you'd pay $10,000 for a used car and then reveal the actual price is $5,000, you'd probably see it as a bargain. But if I anchored with $2,000 first, $5,000 would seem expensive. The initial number, even if arbitrary, influences your judgment. Merchants and negotiators exploit this constantly. Original prices on sale items, opening offers in negotiations, all are anchors shaping subsequent perceptions. Recognizing anchoring doesn't make us immune to it. It's a deeply rooted cognitive bias that evolved because having reference points is often useful, even if it sometimes leads us astray. The endowment effect describes how we overvalue things we already own. If you own a mug, you might demand $7 to sell it, but if you didn't own it, you wouldn't pay more than $3 to buy it. This challenges basic economic theory, which assumes value is value regardless of ownership. But psychologically, owning something creates attachment. This has enormous implications for markets. People are reluctant to sell assets, homes, stocks, for less than they paid, even when it would be rationally optimal to do so, because realizing a loss feels more painful than holding a declining asset. This can exacerbate boom and bust cycles. Confirmation bias means we seek information that confirms our existing beliefs and discard contradictory information. If you believe a company is a great investment, you'll notice positive news and rationalize negative news. If you're skeptical about cryptocurrencies, you'll focus on hacking and bubble stories. This makes it extremely difficult to change your mind based on evidence. In financial markets, it can lead to bubbles when investors reinforce each other's optimism, ignoring warning signs. Echo chambers on social media amplify this effect, creating alternate realities where different groups see the same economic phenomenon in fundamentally incompatible ways. Mental accounting is how we segregate money into different accounts mentally. You might hesitate to spend $100 on a luxury, but happily spend $100 won in a lottery, even though they're interchangeable. Couples might argue about one spouse spending $50 on a hobby, while collectively wasting more on forgotten subscriptions. Rationally, money is fungible. A dollar is a dollar, regardless of origin or intended use. But psychologically, we treat money differently based on context. Recognizing this can improve personal financial decisions, but it also reveals why nudges, small changes in how choices are presented, can dramatically affect behavior. Present bias describes our tendency to overvalue immediate rewards over future ones. We prefer $100 today to $110 in a month, even though waiting is better return. That's why saving for retirement is hard. The pleasure of spending now is tangible, while the benefit of comfortable retirement 30 years from now is abstract. This isn't irrationality, it's biology. Our brains evolved in environments where the future was uncertain, and immediate rewards were often the best strategy. But in modern societies where we live for decades and long-term planning is crucial, this bias sabotages us. Employers who automatically enroll employees in retirement savings plans, with the option to opt out, exploit this, changing the default in favor of beneficial long-term behavior. The sunk cost fallacy is continuing to invest in something because you've already invested, even when cutting losses would be better. You watch a bad movie to the end because you paid for the ticket. A company continues a failed project because it's already spent millions. Governments escalate wars because so much has been sacrificed to quit now. Rationally, sunk costs are irrelevant. Only future costs and benefits should matter. But psychologically, admitting that past investments were wasted seems unbearable. It's loss aversion amplified. Learning to recognize and overcome the sunk cost fallacy is one of the most valuable but emotionally difficult financial lessons. Think about why people gamble in casinos when the odds are mathematically against them. Part is entertainment, but part is fundamental misunderstanding of probability. The gambler's fallacy, believing that past events influence chances of independent future events, if roulette came up red 5 times, black is due, leads to irrational betting. Overconfidence bias makes people believe they're more skilled than they really are, particularly relevant in stock trading where amateur investors often underperform passive index funds because they trade too much, trusting in their stock-picking abilities. The financial industry profits from these cognitive failures. Why do we spend more when using credit cards instead of cash? Because paying with physical money is psychologically painful in ways that swiping a card isn't. Seeing bills leaving your wallet creates payment pain. Cards abstract this away, making spending painless until the bill arrives. Mobile payment apps reduce this friction even further. This is deliberate. Payment systems are designed to be frictionless because friction reduces spending, but this convenience can lead us to spend more than we intended. It's another example of how psychology and technology interact to shape economic behavior in ways that might not be in our best interest. The phenomenon of keeping up with the neighbors, consumption motivated by social comparison rather than need, is ancient but amplified by social media. We see apparently perfect lives of others and feel pressured to spend on status signals. But it's a game that can't be won. There's always someone with more. And strangely, studies show that above a certain income threshold, enough for basic needs and some comfort, more money doesn't significantly increase happiness. What matters more is relative income and perceptions of fairness. People accept modest income if those around them earn similarly, but resent even high income if others earn much more. Our preferences are deeply relational, not absolute. Why do people often fail to follow financial plans even when they know they should? It's the knowing-doing problem. Knowledge doesn't guarantee action. Everyone knows they should save more, exercise, eat healthily. But doing requires self-control, and self-control is a limited resource that depletes. Making financial decisions after a stressful day, when decision fatigue has set in, often leads to worse choices. That's why automating finances, automatic savings deposits, automatic bill payments, works so well. It removes decision from the moment of weakness and aligns default behavior with long-term intentions. Herding behavior, doing what others do, can create bubbles and crashes. When we see everyone buying tech stocks or houses or Bitcoin, we assume they know something we don't. FOMO, fear of missing out, sets in. But often, nobody knows. Everyone is just imitating everyone else. It's collective blindness leading to grossly distorted pricing. When the music stops and the herd turns, crashes occur with the same dynamics. Nobody wants to be the last one holding the hot potato. The irony is that herding behavior, though risky for the collective, is often rational for individuals. If you exit too early, you miss final profits. Exit too late, and you face losses. So everyone watches everyone else trying to time the exit, which often triggers the very stampede everyone fears. The paradox of choice suggests that more options can actually make us less happy. When there are only a few choices, deciding is simple. When there are hundreds, think selecting a retirement plan from dozens of options or choosing a streaming service, we become overwhelmed. Paralysis can result, or perpetual dissatisfaction, thinking that some unchosen option might have been better. Some choices are liberating, many choices are imprisoning. This has implications for how we design financial systems. Giving people infinite options doesn't necessarily empower them. It can incapacitate them. Sometimes well-designed defaults, nudges, that guide toward reasonable options serve people better than unrestricted freedom of choice. Narrative bias is our tendency to construct stories that explain events, even random events. Stock markets rise must be because of policy X or announcement Y. They fall, clearly it's concern Z, but many short-term fluctuations are essentially random noise. We create narratives because our brains crave patterns and explanations. Financial media exploits this, providing post hoc narratives that create an illusion of understanding. But confusing narrative with causal explanation is dangerous. It leads to overconfidence in our ability to predict future markets based on past patterns. As Nassim Nicholas Taleb emphasizes, we vastly underestimate the role of chance and unpredictability. Black swans are in economic outcomes. Money, despite being central to our lives, we rarely taught to think clearly about it. It's not comprehensively taught in schools. Family conversations about money are often taboo or emotionally charged. So we stumble through financial life making predictable mistakes, falling into known traps influenced by biases we don't even notice. But recognition is the first step, understanding that we're not perfectly rational, that our economic intuitions are often misleading, that we need structures and systems to compensate for our psychological limitations. That is real financial wisdom. It's not about picking the right stocks or timing markets. It's about understanding ourselves. And as we approach the end of this journey through economic history, it's time to step back and reflect on the broader patterns. What have we learned through 5,000 years of human experiments with money, exchange, and economic organization? Are there lessons that transcend specific cultures and eras? Are there principles that can guide us as we face future economic challenges? Throughout this journey across millennia, we've visited Sumerian merchants weighing grain, Lydian artisans stamping electrum, Roman legionaries receiving denarii, caravanners crossing relentless deserts, Florentine bankers inventing financial instruments, American revolutionaries printing desperate paper, speculators creating bubbles and crashes, and finally arrived at our world of digital finance and cryptocurrencies. Through all this diversity of times, places, and technologies, certain themes emerge repeatedly, patterns that seem to be deep truths about how humans relate to money and to each other. The first and most fundamental lesson: money is materialized trust. It doesn't matter whether it's a shell, gold coin, paper note, or blockchain entry. Money works only because we collectively trust that others will accept it. This trust can come from multiple sources: intrinsic value, gold has uses and beauty; government guarantee, fiat money, backed by state power; algorithmic scarcity, Bitcoin limited to 21 million units; or simply tradition and inertia. But without trust, the most precious object becomes worthless. That's why hyperinflation is so devastating. It destroys not just purchasing power, but the very trust that makes society function. And rebuilding broken trust is orders of magnitude harder than maintaining it. Second lesson: economic innovation is as much institutional as technological. We often celebrate physical innovations, the invention of coins, paper money, digital payment systems. But equally important were institutional innovations: double-entry bookkeeping, limited liability corporations, central banks, stock markets, insurance, bankruptcy laws. These institutions created structures that enabled cooperation at previously impossible scales. They reduced transaction costs, distributed risks, facilitated trust between strangers. Much of the economic growth of recent centuries comes not from smarter technology, but from smarter institutions that channel human effort more effectively. Third lesson: economies are complex systems with unintended consequences. Changes that seem obviously beneficial can have unexpected side effects. Facilitating credit stimulates growth, but can create debt bubbles. Globalizing trade increases efficiency, but can destroy communities dependent on local industries. Automating finance reduces costs, but can create systemic vulnerabilities when algorithms amplify crashes. There are no free lunches. Every policy choice involves trade-offs, and often the costs are borne by different people than the benefits, creating distributional conflicts that become political struggles. Economists can model scenarios, but real humans live the consequences. Fourth lesson: inequality is not accident. It's often built into economic systems. Throughout history, we've seen how those controlling valuable resources, land, precious metals, financial capital, information, accumulate advantages that compound over time. Wealth generates more wealth through investment returns. Poverty perpetuates itself through denied access to education, credit, and opportunity. Unregulated free markets tend to increase inequality, not decrease it. This doesn't mean markets are bad. They're extraordinarily efficient mechanisms for allocating resources, but it means societies that value some measure of equality and opportunity need to complement markets with redistribution via taxes, public education, social safety nets, and regulations that prevent extreme concentration of power. Fifth lesson: economic crises are inevitable, but their causes and responses are human choices. We've seen countless collapses throughout history: Roman currency debasement, Chinese hyperinflation, European speculative bubbles, the Great Depression, the 2008 financial crisis. Patterns recur: euphoria leading to excessive risk-taking, rationality being replaced by herd mania, regulators falling behind financial innovation, crashes punishing most severely those least culpable. But how societies respond to crises varies enormously. Some impose brutal austerity, deepening suffering. Others invest in reconstruction and reform. Some use crises to consolidate power, others to expand social protections. Crises reveal social priorities and test institutional resilience. Sixth lesson: Technology changes everything about money except the fundamental questions. We've progressed from barter to shells to coins to paper to digits on screens. Each transition was controversial, meeting resistance from those invested in existing systems. Each new form seemed risky, abstract, disconnected from real value, and yet each eventually became normal, seeming natural. Cryptocurrencies and CBDCs are just the latest iterations. But regardless of the form money takes, the same questions persist. Who controls the money supply? How do we balance stability and flexibility? How do we prevent fraud without destroying privacy? How do we ensure broad access while maintaining integrity? How do we distribute scarce resources in ways people consider fair? Technology doesn't answer these questions, it only changes the terms by which we debate them. Seventh lesson: economy is never separate from politics, culture, and values. The fantasy of economics as neutral science, producing objective answers independent of value judgments, is exactly that: fantasy. Every economic system embodies assumptions about human nature, justice, and society's purposes. Free market capitalism assumes that individual pursuit of self-interest through competitive markets generates collective prosperity. Central planning systems assume that coordinated resource allocation can achieve superior results to markets. Reality is that most systems are hybrid, trying to balance markets and government, freedom and regulation, efficiency and equity. These balances reflect specific cultures and values. There is no single right economic system for all societies at all times. Eighth lesson: the human relationship with money is deeply psychological and often contradictory. Money can be both tool and obsession, liberator and enslaver, symbol of success and source of anxiety. We value but distrust those who pursue it. We recognize it can't buy happiness, but structure societies as if it could. We think we're rational about finances, but we're governed by fear, greed, envy, and the full spectrum of human emotions. Understanding our biases and limitations, building systems and habits that protect us from our worst tendencies. This is as important as any technical financial knowledge. We are simultaneously creators and prisoners of the economic systems we build. Ninth lesson: long-term perspectives are often lost in short-term pressures. We know climate change represents existential economic risks, but financial markets with quarterly or yearly horizons struggle to price it. We know investing in education and infrastructure pays dividends for decades, but political cycles incentivize focus on immediate benefits. We know prevention is cheaper than crisis, but resources flow to fighting fires, not preventing them. This tension between urgent and important is a perennial governance challenge. It requires deliberately building institutions and norms that prioritize long-term sustainability, even when politically difficult. 10th lesson: the stories we tell about economics shape economic realities. If we collectively believe the economy is prospering, confidence increases, spending increases, investment flows, and prosperity can materialize. If we believe crisis is imminent, fear leads to hoarding, investment dries up, and recession can become self-fulfilling prophecy. Narratives about who deserves wealth, what constitutes valuable work, which debts are legitimate, all shape policies and outcomes. Economists influence not just through technical analysis, but through stories they tell about how the world works. And all of us, engaging in conversations about economics, are engaged in constructing collective narratives that shape our shared future. So what should we do with these lessons? Humility first. 5,000 years of economic experiment have taught that there are no simple solutions. Anyone promising easy answers or claiming certainty about economic futures is deceiving you or themselves. Complexity requires nuance. It requires recognizing trade-offs. It requires adapting approaches as circumstances change. But humility is not despair. We've also learned much. We know that trustworthy institutions matter immensely. We know that purely unregulated systems tend toward crises and power concentration. We know that collective investments in education, health, and infrastructure create foundations for shared prosperity. We know that transparency and accountability reduce corruption. We know that safety nets enable productive risk-taking while protecting downside. We know that incentives shape behavior in powerful ways. We can build on this knowledge, even acknowledging the limits of our understanding. And perhaps the deepest lesson: money is means, not end. It's a tool for facilitating cooperation, enabling exchange, coordinating collective effort toward shared goals. When it works well, we barely notice it. Transactions flow smoothly, allowing us to focus on meaningful work, relationships, creativity, all that makes life valuable. When it works poorly, when inflation devours savings, when crises destroy security, when extreme inequality fragments societies, it becomes impossible to ignore. The goal should not be accumulating infinite money, but building economic systems that serve human flourishing. Judge economies not just by GDP, but by the well-being, sustainability, justice, and opportunity they provide. As you prepare to rest, perhaps contemplate these threads connecting Mesopotamian farmers, Silk Road merchants, Renaissance bankers, American revolutionaries, Depression victims, modern traders, and you, all participating in this ongoing experiment of how we organize our collective lives, how we value each other's contributions, how we create and distribute abundance. The story hasn't ended. Tomorrow's economic challenges will require creativity, cooperation, and wisdom. But you now carry knowledge from all those who came before, their innovations and their mistakes. It's heritage and responsibility. Use it well, breathe deeply. Let these thoughts settle gently. The history of money is, ultimately, the history of ourselves, our hopes, our fears, our endless ingenuity, and our unending effort to build something better. Rest now, knowing that this journey, as old as civilization, continues with each of us.